We'll open first to questions from the room, and then I will take some questions from our remote participants.
Cool.
But begin with you.
One thing that interests me in looking at the history of performance in particular is that, of course, in Western culture we had an era where boys were often used as a substitute for women for various reasons of historical taboos on allowing women to be public in that particular guise. I wonder if you could comment a bit on the extent to which that infantilization or that crossing of roles relates to youth versus age, because that's something which I don't think you commented so much, but which strikes me as significant in certain cultural contexts, even to the extent that in certain traditions, such as Western classical music, we're even willing to mutilate boys in order to keep their voices to sound like women inadequate.
Repeat to some extent.
Okay, yeah. So the query was I suppose about historical practices of gender performance. Noticing, I guess, on the Jacobean Elizabethan stage, we have the presence of boy actors playing the parts of women, and to what degree that maybe says something about how we understand the relationship between youth and age. Is that fair?
And it's interesting how this concept of the idealized.
Oh, and how that relates to the kind of the
idealization.
I don't know that I have much to say about the idea of infantilization. I guess I'm really conscious of the kind of what those kind of conventions say about the historically contingent standard for what makes up genders. I always recall the kind of the practice of breeching, which persisted for up until really historically recent process, where infants are kind of kept in the same clothes up until the age of like 8 or 10 or 12 in some places, and then the boy children are like, right, you are literally being put in trousers, and now you are a man. And I love the kind of the deliberate artifice of that, but also how seriously it was taken. There is a ritual quality that no one is blinking at. So I think that there's the tension between the old and the young is not something that I'm not particularly conscious of that I could speak to be completely honest. But in terms of theatrical practices of the idea of having boy actors playing female parts or the parts of women, Elizabethan Jacobean theatre is not particularly my area of research. I think one of the things that we have to be difficult about is applying our sensibilities, our reading practices to the audience there and then, of assuming that we know how they saw or read those bodies on stage. The degree to which that performance was non-illusionistic, I think, is something that we have to pay really close attention to. That naturalism and realism, as we understand it now, is an incredibly historically recent invention. And that say what you like about Shakespeare or Webster, these are not naturalistic dramas. So I think there is a rather different logic of maybe gender signification that's at work. But as I say, this is the point where I wish my colleague Vicky Price, who's a brilliant scholar of that era of work, was with me today.
Mine's a sort of historical aspect as well. But you touched a little bit on race. I'm interested in the colonial period, and it's just got me thinking about the way that people were sort of regendered in a colonial context. So you would have women being, say, converted to Christianity and being clothed in a particular way, or being given different activities. Men were the ones who sewed, and then the colonial people came, and suddenly it's the women who do that because that fits in the gender role. I'm just quite interested in the way that performance is forced into a change, and the sort of intercultural aspect of it as well.
Okay, so the idea that the kind of the colonial project, the kind of the gender distribution of roles is kind of only one aspect of a whole series of different kind of, I guess, a politics of racination of kind of making your otherness acceptable. We make your not whiteness acceptable because we can re-engineer it within an existing set of about kind of the dominant culture's gender roles. Is that
Yeah, I suppose that it's given. I'm not sure I'm articulating it very well because I'm just trying to think it through.
Yeah.
But it's just this whole raft of things that were changed, and the way that gender is understood across different cultures, and how that is performed, and how you can maybe you fail to meet the expectations of gender because you've got different cultural understandings, and they can't understand one another. And so how do you how are you failing and how you actually managing to achieve gender.
Okay. So yeah, so the kind of intelligibility of gender might have like quite literal geographic borders to it. That if you move into a different cultural space, you might find yourself failing at gender, even though you're not doing your gender any differently than you were 10 minutes ago. Or alternatively, in the case of the Colonial Project, people might turn up with guns and boats to tell you you've been doing your gender wrong all your life. I think one of the interesting things about one of the things that I would want to pay attention to in thinking about the performativity of gender in relationship to kind of colonial and post-colonial critiques is how sometimes that gender is a very small corner of what's going on actually, or gender is a convenient mask or structure through which other things are being accomplished. That what looks like a manipulation of gender is actually to do with controlling and putting in place relationships of class and authority, for example. It's about configuring a racial difference as a class difference, and that gender is just perhaps a convenient means of doing that, because gender allows us to, let's say, split up certain kinds of labour as belonging to certain kinds of bodies. So that though it looks like gender and is about gender, the structures that are being produced by it are actually about money and power, perhaps. But no, it's interesting question. Thank you.
I have a question, actually, about performance, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how your critical work and your stage work relate to one another, just as a practical question, because I know that one of the things that a lot of us have been kind of thinking about over the last few weeks is that relationship between kind of practice and the theory that we're talking about. In this case, it's a particularly interesting, I think, relationship.
Okay. Before I apply any kind of complex theoretical argument, I should explain that the shows that I've most frequently made at the Fringe have been very, very stupid comedies. Which is not so they don't have politics in them, but they're very stupid, very funny, enjoyable comedies. For me, and maybe I think in different ways for different members of the group I've worked with, one of the interesting questions has been about gender, because comedy certainly as it appears on the circuit is male dominated as a profession, and the executive producer for the Plain Dreadfuls is Idil Sukan, and she and I kind of staged the show together, and the rest of the team are all male identifying. We're all cisgendered men, and one of the things I think that we kind of happened on almost as a strategy through the performance, it was really through the guys' writing actually, was that you kind of take advantage of the maleness of your performance. that not paying attention to it is actually a really, not only is it a cop-out, it misses the opportunity for some really good jokes. So the first years of the show was a sketch show set in Victorian England. And so much of it was about the ridiculousness of kind of male roles in and outside of the home, and of kind of the way in which patriarchal expectations might lead you to do incredibly ludicrous things on the battlefield, because that's what was expected of you. So I don't think any of the three guys, Tom Tuck, David Reed, and Humphrey Kerr, would describe their work as kind of being a fierce commentary on gender, but it couldn't help but be, because it was about Victorian men for a very long time. So my role as a producer sometimes was kind of in offering feedback and kind of helping the show be developed. I mean, a lot of my work is just very pragmatic. It's about stopping disasters from hitting the edge of the stage. Was kind of encouraging them to take that further, to kind of exploit that, and not. Because I think it becomes problematic when you assume that the male perspective in comedy is a default setting. Or it becomes much less interesting for an audience when you assume that your perspective is a default setting.
I don't know if you know anything about this, but I was thinking about maybe the construction of gender in relationship to the digitalized age, and maybe how, I don't know, it's more of an open question. Do you think that maybe the people, if we were talking about video games, for example, do you think that maybe if you play video games, you want to construct some sort of online, like gender, like which is not used, and which is out of the body, or what do you think?
I think there is absolutely the potential for people to use online spaces and video game spaces to create alternatively gendered versions of their identity. I am, though, really conscious that a huge segment of video game culture is dominated by the most kind of archetypally conventional representations of male masculinity and female femininity. There is a toxic thread that runs through the middle of an otherwise fantastic culture of people who are funny and generous and kind to each other. So I'm always a little bit cautious about there is a kind of utopian potential, I think, of people being able to invent digital versions of themselves, but you don't have to hang out for very long on Twitter as a woman with an opinion, for example, to discover that it isn't quite so much a space of enlightened debate as a horrific den of iniquity. So I think the potentiality of that is there, and I think that absolutely the capacity for people to form communities of identification which extend beyond their geographic location is really, really important. So that if you are a queer person who lives anywhere but a heavily urban centre, actually your access to other queer people might well be through digital means. So yeah, I mean, I can talk about individual examples of video games which are really, really interesting and do seem to be speaking in varying degrees about a queer experience. But however much those works are becoming more common, they are an outlier, I think. And I say that as a huge fan of those games, but looking at the broader scale of things, yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about games?
Okay.
I'm just curious.
There's a game I can recommend for you called Gone Home, and it's a game which takes the form of you play a college-aged young woman, and you come home to discover that to the family house, and that everyone is out, the house is deserted, and the main mechanic of the game is you trying to work out where everyone has gone, and you kind of explore the space of the house, like uncovering like letters and books and answer phone messages, and it's primarily exploratory, and sometimes there's material which is like there in the game, so you actually read letters, and there are some instances where you trigger sound recording, so you have this kind of diegetic and non-diegetic information being given to you, but you hear voice acting as well. And as the performance goes on, you kind of have as the game is played, you realise that there's a little bit of a kind of crisis in the family, like your father who's an author is kind of struggling to write and struggling to write well. But what the central thread of the story is that your younger sister seems to have been in a relationship with another young woman, and so you start to unravel this very difficult relationship that this young woman is having with herself, and this form of disclosure that she's struggling with both publicly, but also to herself through kind of the letters that she's writing. So in many ways, it's a game which kind of frustrates all of like the expectations of like the first-person game. You know, there's no guns, there's no running, there are no enemies. There's a beautifully dismissive review of the game which was put up online, which said this is, there's no guns, no enemies. This is in effect a lesbian scavenger hunt, which I thought was amazing, and also like accidentally complimentary. But it's a game in which, rather than shooting stuff, you're drawn to pick up objects and turn them over, and there's a real tactile quality to the exploration in the game, which I think is really interesting. But though it becomes kind of very clear that this is about a young woman having her first kind of same-sex relationship and coming to terms with it, although I was like, slightly awkward phrase because it suggests that some kind of terrible burden that she's coming to terms with, but she's recognizing, she's understanding what it is dealt with so obliquely, and that it requires you as a player to do the work of putting these elements together. It's a game which requires, I think, it places a burden of like emotional intelligence on you to kind of reconstruct the emotional lives of this family, of which as the player you are supposed to be a member, but of which you have become slightly slightly divorced because you've been away at college all year. So that's a really lovely game. That is a kind of quite an indie game. It's a kind of niche game. You could also look at mass market games, though. Look at things like Dragon Age, where there's the possibility of it's a kind of sword and board kind of game. You know, you're fighting with magic, you're fighting dragons, hundreds of people dead during the course of 30 or 40 hours of play. But you can get married, and you can get married to a whole range of different people of different species. Your gender presentation and opposite sex, opposite gender partners as well. And that's like a mass market game, hundreds of $1 million budget. But there are opportunities for that play seem to be emerging there as well. So there's a particular company called BioWare who I think are particularly well known for producing games which have interesting and adult in all kinds of ways content in them.
That's wonderful, thank you. I was just dying of curiosity. I do have a question from the board, which remains in the visual a little bit. This is from a student of art history. And the question is this: can you speak to the use of gendered and biological analogies in critical discourse, and how this might relate to Butler's theory of performativity? She's citing a long tradition in art history of discussing works, movements, entire bodies of work in gendered terms. And I think the biological aspect is particularly interesting to me, because you do talk about things in biological analogies.
Yeah, and it's I think I'm trying to think what the term is. I was reading some more of her Butler's work this afternoon. There's a few thoughts that occur to me, one of which is a kind of caginess around the idea of what we might call strategic essentialism. You might have come across this idea in the work of Gayatri Spivak. So this idea that sometimes for the purposes of reaching a particular goal, that you will come together under a kind of a banner of uniformity. Yeah, you will strategically essentialize yourself in order to accomplish particular goals. I think that there is a kind of sometimes a strategic essentialism which takes place in critical studies, where it is more convenient, it is easier to kind of apply biologistic kind of determinations of sex and gender, because it's a hell of a lot easier than wading into the weeds of queer theory and performativity. So it's a little bit of a kind of sometimes a default setting that goes, hey, look, we're cool, we're liberal critics, we're cool, but for the sake of just getting through this damn article in under 50,000 words, I'm going to default to these standard settings. So there is a kind of, I don't know how, it's a strategic essentialism which isn't as politically innovating politically invigorating as Spivak would suggest. This is a kind of laziness, perhaps. That's the first thing that springs to mind, perhaps. The other kind of dimension to this, and again, it doesn't speak directly to kind of art history, but I think it's the fact that our scholarship reflects broader trends in what we think liberalism looks like. So, for example, even though we do have, since the kind of early 1990s, this kind of body of queer theory and radical feminist thought and other elements of gender studies which make these increasingly interesting and consequential claims about not essentializing the body, about recognizing a whole range of different gendered and fleshed people which are fully human, you then look at the activities of a mainstream group like Stonewall, who continue to make very straightforwardly biologistic claims about sexuality. Yeah, the discourse of you are born this way. Yeah, that gay people just are. They just exist. The idea that gayness isn't in some way culturally constructed is put aside, because to get into that debate opens up a whole can of worms, and then suddenly they're trying to defend that gay people are worthy of protection. What you have instead is a discourse which does this strategically essentializing gesture of kind of going, particularly in relationship to gay young people, to kind of young queer people, young kind of lesbian, bisexual and gay people, is to go, they just are. So you have the slogan, some people are gay, get over it. They just are gay, get over it. We can't even talk about it. We can't talk about how their gayness comes about, get over it. Move on, move on. I need to talk, get over it. And it's a generous gesture, yeah. It's supposed to be like it's rhetoric which is directed towards people who can't come to the terms with the fact that there might be not straight people out there. Yeah, that's the intended rhetoric of it. But it also places sexuality. It places this idea somehow out of reach of examination. So it becomes a And that is seen as a liberalising gesture, which I think is a really interesting political turn, which I think is then reflected in our contemporary scholarship. We think that's what liberalism looks like.
Also, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like it also goes back to that conflation of kind of sexual orientation, the body, and gender identity, that those kind of all fall together in this, in this way of talking. And that, is that just comfortable? I mean, is it easy?
Yeah, well, I mean,
it's lazy?
I think it's totally functional. It's totally tactical. If you are trying to win public support, if you are trying to persuade a potentially hostile government, or you're trying to get funders to come on board with you, and the result is whether you do or don't have money to help people who are at risk, then yeah, you behave tactically perhaps. So maybe I'm picking the idea that I might grumble about what Stonewall is doing. It's like, get over yourself, Stephen. The fact that Stonewall isn't doing the radical queer work of Jack Halberstam, whatever. It's like, well, that's not what they're not interested in. That they've never been interested in that. But yeah, it's tidy and it's convenient, but it's the tidiness of it which is troublesome, and it's also, I mean, that's part of a kind of broader critique that comes out of queer studies and in my own writing of the centrality of things like marriage, but that takes us along a different route from the subject of today's lecture.
You've already talked about this idea of societal norms and how they influence people, but I wonder if you could perhaps elaborate on how these norms may vary within the society, depending on certain roles that a person might take. I'm thinking in particular about, for example, occupation. So perhaps it is considered more standard for, say, someone working in theatre or someone working in an artistic profession to one, be gay, and two, be openly gay, than, say, someone who works perhaps as a church minister, to give a really extreme example, perhaps, or that you can think there are certain occupations where it seems taboo to discuss sexuality openly, or perhaps where it's considered more taboo to be of a non-normative status.
Okay, so the questions, just for the sake of the people elsewhere, it was about whether the degree to which norms vary in relationship to different social roles, and particularly different occupations. So the kind of example being that if you work in the arts, if you work in the theatre, it's therefore more acceptable to be gay, or you're likely to kind of encounter more gay people, as opposed to if you were a minister, or if you worked on an oil rig or something, or some other kind of suitably butch profession. It was really weird when you try and describe, obviously, the natural butchness of the oil rig. There you go. There's the weirdness of gender. And like, why have I gendered the oil rig? Where did that come from? I think, I mean, there's an interesting double bind to that. And again, this goes back to some of the things that actually the early gay and lesbian theatre was trying to look at and was trying to address. One of the things that motivated Gay Sweatshop was actually the false apprehension that the theatre profession was necessarily friendly to gay people. So though there might be a lot of gay people around, there weren't very many openly gay people around, and also a lot of the theatre work they were being asked to participate in was producing quite stereotypical and derogatory images of gay people and of gay men and lesbians. So the idea that the theatre space had lots of gay people in it doesn't necessarily mean that space is an affirmative space, that is a productive space. Actually, it might require you to be closeted in all kinds of different ways. I mean, we might look now to the number of openly gay actors who are at the top of the profession, either in theatre or particularly in film and TV. There are, I mean, even allowing for the fact that non-heterosexual people make up probably a relatively small percentage of the population, it's a vanishingly tiny number of people who can claim to be top-ranked film stars who are also openly gay. It doesn't market well, I think, is the generically reductive argument that's given. So I think, yes, I think that there are some professions where people kind of go into them, and there is a kind of cultural attachment to them, that there is this expectation that, if you work in the city, you work for a merchant bank, you need to present yourself in a certain kind of uniform way, and that turning up with multiple piercings and hair of a particular colour is not acceptable, and that there's a dress code which is written into the terms of your contract. But if you work for an indie art gallery, or for if you work for a gallery or an arts venue, that there is a different kind of cultural set of attachments which at work. Absolutely, I'd agree with that. I'm just very wary about fetishizing the alternative spaces as being therefore automatically affirmative. That you might find yourself the performance of your gender being constrained in not new and exciting set of ways. An argument that comes out in can I remember her name? I'll remember her name in a second, but a really interesting idea which comes about kind of compulsory queerness. In order to be queer, you must be continually dissenting, you must be continually trying to kind of shatter or break the norms of gender and sexuality, that you can't be kind of boringly queer. You always have to be threateningly and disruptively queer. And that compulsive queerness, that compulsion to be queer in a particular way, takes on the quality of a whole new norm. You must be radical, but you must be radical in these ways.
This speaks to a point that you already raised, right? Where what was at one point kind of disruptive depends in some ways on its other normal, the thing that it's disrupting.
Yeah.
And that those two things are always kind of in communication and in some ways in collusion with one another. If we think about it in binary terms like that, where you have the dominant and the disruptive.
Yeah.
You know, if we're thinking in binary terms like that. I have a question about the very boring, a question about the workplace. It's actually a great question. And it's one that I think, particularly as a woman in academia, I think about a lot. So the question is this: my PhD involves communication within the workplace. I'm interested to know your thoughts about why certain gender norms are adapted in different contexts. So, for example, women adopting more masculine traits to secure career progression, and why some performative discursive enactments are valued or are perceived, and this is a really interesting phrasing, perceived to be more successful than others. This question of success, and I say this, speaking of clothing, very conscious of my jacket, my blazer, my professional clothing. So could you speak a little bit to the way that these performances relate to the question of labor and the workplace and success and value?
I guess I mean there are a few observations, some of which are kind of not my arguments, so really reflect, I guess, broader arguments made in feminist scholarship, which is that the standard for what constitutes success has, in many respects, stayed the same, and the pool of people allowed to take part in that success has broadened slightly. So the fact that more women or more people from a different range of class or ethnic backgrounds are allowed to take part in certain jobs hasn't really changed the determination of what success is in those circumstances. That would be my first thought. So that in order to kind of to succeed in what was once a conventionally male space still requires you to adopt traditionally male or masculine definitions of, or at least definitions which came about when the space was exclusively male. Yeah. And those have just remained the same, and they're perceived somehow to be neutral. They're not perceived to be gendered at all. And so and the clue that they are gendered perhaps is the degree to which fulfilling them requires you to perform yourself in a certain way, in a way which is like a man, to put it really crudely.
Well, or like a certain performance.
Yeah.
I remember being instructed in actually very clear and kind of frighteningly explicit terms when I started teaching that I needed to either be this kind of female in the classroom or this kind of female in the classroom, and that like this other thing you were doing just then isn't going to work for you quite. You probably shouldn't do that. Yeah. Right.
And I think that's an extraordinary thing that applies to kinds of. I'm trying to think what the hashtag is on Twitter. You see these great/horrifying discussions of this, and it is particularly the advice that comes out both from male academics, but also from more established female academics, which is advice given to younger women entering the profession about how to conduct themselves. And it is fiercely normative in all kinds of ways. But you do often see it somehow. You also see it in the feedback that you get from students. That students will make comments about their teachers who present as women that they would never ever think about their staff who present as men. And it's a bit unnerving sometimes that when you see the kind of comments come back, and they're not thankfully, certainly in my job here, I've never had to do anything like deeply unpleasant. But there is a kind of tonal thing. There's a kind of commentary which is about somehow, which is about appearance actually. That reflects maybe a kind of, again, a wider culture that the value of female-bodied people is located there. Even though this is a professor, even though this is a person with a PhD standing in front of you, that person is also woman-bodied, and therefore we need to exert this other set of judgments. And it's strange that, speaking as someone who I'm kind of conscious that the advantage of my increasingly cisgendered presentation, I say increasingly cisgendered because I discovered the gym a couple of years ago and I have a different shaped body now, is genuinely, it's been so interesting and in a very dull way for everyone else, that my students do behave or respond to me in lecture spaces because I present and I appear like this in the way that I do. And that one of the decisions I've taken in teaching, and I spend a lot of time teaching gender and sexuality to undergraduate students, is to draw attention to the terms of my presentation which they kind of see as a default. So when I point out to them that I nearly always wear exactly the same thing in front of them, that I nearly always wear damn close to actually what I'm wearing today, actually, black t-shirt, blue trousers. And then I say, do you ever notice if I've shaved or not? And I noticed, do you like my choice of watch? Do I wear a watch when I'm lecturing or you or not? And then we talk about what construction of maleness or masculinity do I present in front of them. So it's a bit of a risk sometimes, but I have stood in front of seminar groups and kind of gone, I need you to tell me what are the signs of Stephen? If this is a performative artifact in front of you, what am I doing to create the effect, the illusion that I'm actually here? It is a bit of a gamble. But also I think it's one that I'm in a position of relative security, so why not? I don't always do it, but why not?
I mean, to go back to this question about success, though, and value, I mean, some of what you seem to be saying is that not just that we are gendered and that we perform gender, but actually that value is gendered in some way by virtue of having been constructed discursively in a discursive place that was dominated by a certain performance of gender at a certain point in history.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I would struggle I'd be able to go away and find some references, but I think absolutely there are forms of labour which have been shown to be undervalued because they have been done historically by women, which, when men move into the exact same workspace, suddenly start being valued more highly. I don't know if any of you are sociologists. We could go away and find the case studies. They're kind of terrifyingly transparent, which shows that if you change the gender composition of the workforce, suddenly that workforce is considered to be essential and actually deserving of a higher wage. Structural sexism really isn't that subtle. It's like you can say what you like about structural sexism, but subtlety isn't one of its major problems. So yeah, no, I think it's the values associated are painfully transparent sometimes. There's yeah.
Does this relate to the way we value knowledge? I mean, which is supposed to be so abstract and kind of.
Yeah. Well, we can look at the relationship, maybe, or the standing of arts and humanities subjects in relationship to funding structures. We might also pay attention to the degree to which the disproportionate or underfunding of certain areas of the arts and humanities have a disproportionate effect on women or people who present as women, because the vast majority of scholars in the arts and humanities, well, actually no, I won't say the vast majority, I think it is the majority, are women. The science and engineering is male dominated. So there are forms of knowledge which are populated differently according to gender, I think. And then when money follows certain kinds of knowledge production, because it has a certain kind of direct application, it does have broader effects in stabilizing particular kinds of value. We're then getting into really large sociological questions, which I have opinions about, but they're just that, they're opinions. I'm on the edge of my expertise very much there.
interesting that we talk about these issues of facets and how men and women are treated in the workplace. I wonder if you could comment on the issue of the perception of authenticity. You sometimes in debate, especially when things get very vituperative online, sometimes encounter people say you have no right to comment on this because you're not a man or because you're not a woman. I wonder what you view the implications of such authenticity paradigms as being, and to what extent does queer theory choose to draw on them, or perhaps try and dissociate itself?
Okay, so the question is about authenticity and the way in which authenticity claims serve to legitimate certain viewpoints or the legitimacy of various people even to speak. My approach has been, first of all, I think whenever we get into the claim of what is or isn't authentic, it feels like it always involves some kind of deferral of judgment. So that when we kind of go, this is the unified experience of being a man or being a woman, there is a certain level of, let's say, communal shared experience that I have with other male-bodied people because I grew up in the same culture as them. But then immediately I'm starting to think about how my experience was inflected by my middle-classness, my whiteness, the fact that I went to a Catholic primary school. So as soon as I start to get into any kind of consequential difference, I'm like, which thread of that constitutes my authentic masculinity? So I always feel a little bit concerned about that because I don't know where we draw the line, because that line always involves a kind of a performative rather than constative claim. Yeah, we're always having to draw a line in the sand somewhere. It doesn't mean that we don't have collective and communal experiences. It doesn't mean that we're not treated in a certain way because of our presentation, because we appear to be of a particular race, because we appear to be of a particular class, because we are of those races or those classes. But I struggle to know where we can productively draw the line. So my position, or the strategy I've tried to take, and I don't know it's always a successful one, has been to think about authentication rather than authenticity. So to think about the processes, the discourses, the context by which authenticity is achieved and claimed. Yeah. So you shift the center of attention from the kind of unchallengeable claim on the authentic, yeah, because either the authentic is or isn't. Yeah, and you shift it to something which we can actually maybe have a conversation about, which is discourses of authentication. How are things verified? How are things made to seem real and true? Because that, to me, is more useful because it tells you where the power lies. And it tells you, certainly in a kind of performative sense, which conventions or reiterative processes are at stake and are perhaps open to change. So, yeah, my interest has been to shift from the question of the authentic, which seems to be slightly unresolvable, to the question of authentication, which seems to be productively open to debate. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't worry, this is what I've been doing for the last half hour.
I'm just more sculptural and it's more like the artistic identity on that. I'm very interested in your experience as a practitioner, where you're back with wanting to be expressing something that isn't contrived and that isn't necessarily inspired by playfulness. So I'm just thinking about your experience as a practitioner in making work that is coming from a place of direct response and true whatever true expression or direct experience that is performative because it's lived, not playful in terms of being contrived.
So the question, again, for the other people, the question is the relationship between our lived experiences and what we might do as practitioners and the degree to which they are sincere and or playful.
Yeah,
is that
almost things like that from modern to an artist as it means to the artist, being, I think you summed up better than
But yeah, no, I think that
the artist is being more
yeah, the role of the artist as the kind of the figure of authenticity is I'm the kind of work that I've been involved in making has not ever really been I would say autobiographical in any kind of strong sense. Although some of the improvisational work that movement-based work that I've done is probably the closest to that in terms of a kind of a process of, I guess, somatic expression, although it's not verbalized. I think there is a hearty tradition of solo autobiographical performance, and this is partly what I'm trying to write about in the current book that I'm working on, in which in which suffering serves to authenticate the content of the artistic experience, and that sits within, I think, a far broader tradition of what we think martyrs and saints are. So I think I am more interested, both as a practitioner and as a researcher, is work which acknowledges and plays with those conventions. So I've spent the last few weeks writing about the work of a performer called Adrian Howes, who was based here in Glasgow up until a couple of years ago, unfortunately, when he died, and he was a creative fellow actually in theatre studies up until a few years ago, and he produced this piece of work called the 14 Stations of Adrian Howes. And it's a piece of work which is this autobiographical promenade piece, which is structured very loosely along the kind of the 14 Stations of the Cross. So these are the 14 stations, the kind of the biblical narrative. It's the Passion of the Christ. Yeah. So it's the suffering and pain of Christ going from his trial up the hill to Golgotha, the place of the skull, his crucifixion, his entombment, and his resurrection. Yeah, so a nice, light thematic structure to work with, and it's a work where, on the one hand, it's kind of painfully autobiographical. It involves these disclosures of these really painful moments in his life. Not only how he was badly treated by other people, but also like what he sees as his own failings, like his own narcissism, his own selfishness. And there's a couple of moments in it which are so. They're really interesting because you're really not sure what he was trying to intend, and I think the indeterminacy is exactly the effect. So that he kind of forces himself to cry and makes you watch him cry. And there's a couple of really interesting kind of responses to this that people have written, kind of journal articles who saw the work, who talk about it in terms of like not feeling anything at all. And kind of having the opposite reaction to this. You know, this was clearly a real emotional experience he once had, but it's now being restaged and forced for us. And I feel really awkward that I feel like I'm supposed to owe you something in this outpouring of emotion, and I don't feel anything at all, and I kind of want it to be over. So I think that I'm really interested in those kinds of moments. There's a lovely term which I like. It's always good when you learn new words. Such a nerd. Extimacy. Extimacy, so the exteriorization of intimacy. And it's kind of thought about in terms of this experience which is void of emotion, actually. It's all on the outside, there's nothing on the inside. And I think that sometimes that queer performance is particularly interested in that, of playing with the emotional stakes of real experience. There is absolutely a big, a huge body, huge tradition of queer work in which autobiographical material is put to work in service of truth claims, and importantly and valuably done. You know, I think it's very important that those works exist and continue to exist. I'm slightly more interested in this work which takes that convention and starts to kind of play with our expectations of it. And in the case of that work, the 14 Stations of Adrian Howes, serves to kind of challenges you to think as a participant in that work about what kind of responsibility or attachment you have to another person. When you see another person suffering, what does that response supposed to involve? You know, the instant I'm supposed to be empathetic question. So there's something interesting about what's the morality of that exchange. So that's slightly apart from your question, but that's what's immediately in my head.
I'm interested in the fact that by witnessing that you are aware of an experience that was authentic.
Yeah.
Whether you're experiencing it and watching it, it's still really interesting.
Yeah. Because, I mean, the idea of the... I mean, I should say that the 14 Stations work was a one-to-one performance, so it's just you and him. So, and this is like one of the qualities of the witness. The witness is a privileged observer. So you've seen something that not many people, perhaps no one else has seen, and that possibly, as a consequence, there is an imperative that you will tell other people. That's the quality of the witness. And again, I think that's part of the framework of the work as a one-to-one show, is that it exploits the fact that you are there by yourself.
It's so interesting in the I'm sorry, I'm just going to follow a little bit. It's so interesting in the context of performance. If we take performance out of live theater and put it, say, on television or on film, where we register authenticity as like a sign of the actor's craft or art, depending on how you see it, right? But we know. I mean, the whole game is that you're pretending to do this, that you're pretending to cry, and the way we play it is to say, how well are you convincing me that what you're doing is real? And that's how we talk about it, isn't it? When we talk about like really virtuosic performance in film or
and it's also the performance of realness in really specific territories. So this is partly to do with like the default setting of naturalism and realism, which we don't pay much attention to, this iconicity thing, where we do the staggering thing of casting the part of the old woman with a woman who happens to be old, and casting the part of the attractive young woman with an actor who happens to be an attractive young woman. And that you rarely kind of walk out of a piece of theatre and kind of going, yeah, that guy playing the young guy, I think he did being a young guy really well. There's a bit of the performance we're not paying attention to. That's not part of our judgment on the authenticity of it. Their young male bodiedness or their old woman bodiedness is just, that's like, well done. You've occupied your body successfully wearing a costume for an hour. It's a good definition of acting, actually. You've successfully occupied your body wearing your non-standard clothing for an hour. But yeah, I think that I mean, it's slightly it speaks to the dominance of naturalism and realism as the default setting for most of our entertainment. Which again is, not suggesting it's a terrible or an excellent thing. It's just the default setting, which has consequences. But yeah.
Although we do say that people do a very good job when they inhabit somebody that we assume is not their real one for an hour or whatever. You played the old man very well, you might say, as a young actor, or you played, again, gender.
Yeah, and I think and it suddenly becomes that's what's exceptional. That's what's we get to see the intricacy of the craft of the rubber mask that's been applied, the wig that's gone on. There's a video that's going around online at the moment, which is Robin Williams doing the screen test stuff for his appearance in Mrs. Doubtfire, which I can recommend for you because of his as the kind of the test footage goes on, his negotiation with the makeup and his voice as well, where he tries to work out how English or how Scottish she should be. So something quite interesting about someone developing the drag performance that they will occupy in the film on the fly. So it's really interesting because it's live as opposed to it's live in a different way than the presentation in the film, which is carefully edited, constructed. The performance by that point has been stabilised to render the character of Mrs. Doubtfire, and discreetly from that, I can't remember what the other character's called, but the husband character. In the test footage, it's Robin Williams blurring in and out of Mrs. Doubtfire. And there's something much more interesting about that. You can watch that for a couple of hours, actually.
So I have actually, if there's other questions or comments from the room, now is the time. I have two comments from the board. I think in closing, and one is to return to this question of work and labor and the way that expectations fit into a kind of a workplace setting and into a situation where actually it's not just a question of we're actually earning our keep in some way here. Mm-hmm. There are certain everyday stakes in this way, And it's about the kind of inability to kind of get it right for anyone who exceeds a certain conventional setting, and this is to return to the question specifically of gender, that there's a kind of a way of performing. In this case, the question is about masculinity in fields previously or still dominated by men, and that anyone who doesn't kind of perform that can't win, which is to say, gets to keep making lower wages or gets to keep But is there some way in which what we should be saying is that none of us ever perform that? Is that an implication?
I think that is one of the kind of broader implications, or I think it's in some places an explicit argument that Butler makes, is that none of us are ever occupy fully the ideal of what it is to be a masculine man or a feminine woman. That even if we're doing it really well, we do it in a culture which is telling us we're not doing it quite right yet. There is a literal industry of we can go shopping now for magazines for men and for women, much worse for women than for men, but nonetheless a publishing industry which is full of very good advice on how to be better at being the stuff that you're supposed to be able to do naturally by default. So it's there is a gendered there is a kind of cultural industry which is about telling us how to do our gender properly, which suggests which has directed the most kind of successful instances of men and women, which is, I think, very, very interesting. I think possibly we need a few more magazines which are less paranoid, which are not telling you you're doing it wrong, but telling you, which suggest new ways that you might like to try doing it right. This is mainly the reason I'm not the editor of any women's magazines yet.
I have finally an anecdote from the oil rig, which is
okay.
I live in Aberdeen, and one of my close gay friends works offshore. He lives a completely binary life with two different, entirely different personas, one for home and one for work. So not only might we all be interestingly different and non-normative, but we can be multiple, I suppose.
Yeah, this is part of maybe the ambition of the trajectory of queer theory, this idea that the extending the range of lives which are livable. Now, I'm always really conscious whenever I teach or whenever I speak about the choice of my language, and that the continued reiteration today of male, masculine, female, feminine, is I'm always worried that. Well, not worried, concerned that it might represent a kind of foreclosure of the whole range of kind of gendered bodies which have no interest or no part in those terms. And that similarly, when I refer to gay and lesbian, that I always kind of am mentally appending gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender and asexual and queer, and that we are sometimes in a struggle with terms of reference to talk about this material in a way which is actually genuinely expansive, which isn't just a rote listing of all of those kind of categories, so I can show I am properly liberal and inclusive and I am good, but to actually for that to be part of a meaningful extension of the possibilities of being human. And I think you just have to. My attempt is just to keep attempting it. In truth, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, and thank all of you for your questions and your comments. All of you out there in the ether for your questions and comments. And yes, we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.